Nós já iremos começar o próximo painel. Antes, para os brasileiros que estão aqui, eu queria fazer um breve comentário sobre o professor Klarman. Ele é o professor de Direito Constitucional mais popular aqui, né? Para a gente conseguir uma matéria com ele, a gente tem que colocar ele na primeira preferência, mesmo assim as listas de espera são enormes. Ele é uma enciclopédia, ele sabe tudo sobre direito constitucional, história americana, enfim. Foi muito bacana ter a oportunidade de ouvi-lo aqui um pouco sobre a história. Eu agora vou introduzir em inglês os nossos próximos participantes, e esse painel agora vai falar um pouco sobre os desafios institucionais em países emergentes. So, good morning, everyone. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to thank you for being here. I want to say that I'm very honored and thrilled to moderate the panel Institutional Challenges in Developing Countries, which is aimed at providing insights and tools to critically assess the quality of our institutions and think new ideas to better Brazil and other developing countries. Our distinguished panelists are Professor Rohini Pande and Justice Luís Roberto Barroso. I welcome you here. Thanks. I'll pass to Justice Barroso.
Dear Aline Osório, dear Professor, my dear friends, it's a pleasure to be here and to share with you all some ideas and some reflections on institutional challenges in developing countries. That was quick.
I said I would rather have a dialogue than to talk at people.
I was still finishing up my notes here. It's a great pleasure for me to talk to Brazilian judges, and especially at trial court level judges. I think, I'm not a career judge, as you certainly know, but I think you've been doing a terrific job in Brazil and changing the judiciary and then the country from the bottom to the top. And of course, this major role that judges are playing in Brazil right now do subject them to all sorts of attacks from an old order that would like to keep things as they have always been. But the first thing I want to say is keep up the good work. I think you are on the right side of history, and the country really needs you. And I think that you are the trustees of a lot of hope that the country has right now on the capacity of the judiciary to change habits that are so ingrained and that have naturalized wrong things that people don't even notice that they were there. The second thing I would like to say is there is a wave of negativity in Brazil right now that does affect the self-esteem of people. And I want to say I wasn't caught by this wave. I think we are in the process of changing paradigms, changing the country. I do think we have a great chance to refound the country on higher public and private ethics levels. And I think we should not miss this chance. So I'm very optimistic on how things are going. The problem is the picture of the current moment. I think I'm going to talk from there. I like to see people when I talk and make sure they're not going like this. I think the problem is with the picture of the moment we are living. We have a good history. The 30 years of Brazilian democracy have generated a good history, although the current picture is devastating. So I think a good sentence, a good quote that would summarize what we're going through, we can find in Antonio Gramsci, when he wrote, "The crisis," wrote Gramsci, "consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appears." So I think we are in the process of moving from the old to the new one. And the picture does reflect the morbid symptoms of the difficulties in this transition. But as I was saying, I think we are in the process of refounding the country. So I don't feel like the character of the story my good friend Carlos Aires likes to tell, that this guy went to the doctor and the doctor tells him, "I have bad news for you. I have bad news and I have even worse news for you." And he asks, "Well, tell me the bad ones first." And the doctor says, "You only have 24 hours of life." So, well, what could be worse than that? I've been meaning to tell you since yesterday. Well, I would like to start this talk on a positive note. The first positive note I would like to highlight here is that 30 years of life in any constitution in Latin America, the endurance of a constitution for that long, is an achievement that we should celebrate. So this is the first thing. And it has been a normative constitution in the sense that it has been a constitution that actually apprehends the political process and to a great extent has been able to domesticate the political process. So the first thing in institutional debate I would like to say is I don't think we should throw away the political capital that the Constitution represents. And I am totally against convening a new constitution in Brazil. I don't think it's time, I don't think it's convenient, and I think this constitution, which is not ideal, has, however, helped very successfully for Brazil to make the transition from an authoritarian regime to a democracy. And I would be very scared of what could come next if we would get rid of this constitution and restart this discussion. Whoever here lives in Brasilia, I think there is a good story that can illustrate what I think. I live by the lake in Brasilia, and a few months ago, a family of capybaras started living in my garden. It started with 4, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32. So they just keep multiplying, and I was scared about that. And you can't touch a capybara. It's an environmental crime, no bail, if you kill a capybara. So I asked my personal trainer, who lives in Brasilia, has been there forever, said, "What's the predator? Who is the predator of capybaras?" And he says, "Onça." So, you know, I started to think they were kind of good-looking and charming because, I mean, onça or tiger or jaguar, I don't know how to translate onça to English. So I would stick with what we know that, you know, won't be too harmful. And this Constitution, I think I should say, has helped us with 3 great achievements that we should celebrate. The first one is institutional stability. We've had 30 years of institutional stability. I know the younger ones won't give too much importance to this, but Brazil, in the worst Latin American tradition, has always been the country of the coup d'etat, of the overthrowing of governments, of breaches of constitutional legality. It's been like this forever, since the first moment when Peter I dissolved the first Constitutional Assembly, until the military coup of 1964. So 30 years of institutional stability is an achievement that we should celebrate. And these have been no ordinary times. we've had difficulties and scandals like the Mensa loan, like the Petro loan, like the car wash operation. We've had the impeachment of 2 presidents that were elected by popular vote, and still no one ever, so far, cogitated of any solution that would not be the respect for the Constitution. So many of us who have seen the darkness of a dictatorship, we know how much we appreciate living under democratic institutions that are stable, like Brazilian ones have been. The second achievement that I think we should celebrate, and still highlighting some positive aspects of these 30 years, and the point I'm trying to make is the snapshot of this moment is dramatic, but the movie of the Brazilian democracy, the 30-year movie of the Brazilian democracy, is a fairly good one. So the second achievement I would like to highlight here is monetary stability. Whoever is over 40 here, there are a few of us that are over 40 here, knows the horrors of hyperinflation and how terrible it was to live with all those failures, those economic plans that never worked, Cruzado 1, Cruzado 2, Bresser, Verão, Collor 1, Collor 2, and the dramatic situation that it was living under hyperinflation. Always noting that hyperinflation is very cruel to the poor, because whoever has money and capital, you can preserve it in financial markets. But if you are living on wages, you just see your money devaluate every day. So hyperinflation was one of the causes that aggravated this abyss of inequality that we still have in Brazil. And then in the mid-90s, we were finally able to tame inflation, and although it haunts us every once in a while, we do have a currency and monetary stability in Brazil, and that was an important change. And with monetary stability came fiscal responsibility. We are still learning this lesson, but one thing that is important in Brazil, and an idea that's catching up, is that fiscal responsibility has no ideology. It's not left-wing or right-wing. It's just a premise of the economy. And if you spend more than you collect, you either bring the rise of interest rate or you bring inflation. So fiscal irresponsibility is always harmful to the poor. And I think this is a lesson we are still learning, but it's a very important lesson. And it came with monetary stability, because inflation could kind of hide the mismanagement of budgets. And the third and last achievement I would like to highlight here, and I think we should celebrate, is social inclusion. Okay, the good thing that I'm talking from here is that I can see you. The bad thing is that I can't see my notes. But the third achievement is social inclusion. In 30 years of democracy, over 30 million, between 30 and 40 million people in Brazil left the line of extreme poverty. In these 30 years of democracy, Brazil had the fastest growing level of Human Development Index in Latin America and Caribbean. Brazilians live now over 11 years than they used to live 30 years ago, and the income increased by 55%. And in the goals of the millennium, the goal of the millennium was, before 2015, to get 50% off the line of extreme misery, and we had almost 70% of achievement. So social inclusion was also a point that in these 30 years of democracy, we can celebrate. I know that with the economic crisis of the past years, there have been problems, and around 4 million people fell back in poverty. But still, the balance is very favorable. So to end this first chapter, what I want to say is that in 30 years, we were, in one generation, 30 years of democracy, we were able to defeat the dictatorship, extreme poverty, and to promote very impressive social inclusion in Brazil. So there's no battle that is invincible, I think I should say. And I think we live in Brazil at this moment a fortunate and immense demand for integrity, for idealism, for patriotism. And I'm very convinced that this powerful energy is the energy that shifts paradigms and pushes history forward. That's the reason why I'm very optimistic about the things that are going on in Brazil. The other point, the positive point I would like to highlight briefly is that in these 30 years of democracy, we made a lot of progress in an area that we had felt behind, which is the protection of fundamental rights. And I just wrote down a quick list of achievements in this area of fundamental rights protections. Women's rights, probably no change is more visible in Brazil in the past 30 years than the changes in the recognition of women's rights and their role in the job market, protection against violence, and even sexual rights in a conservative country like Brazil has experienced important advancements in the anencephalic fetuses case decided by the Supreme Court, and even in the abortion case decided by the first panel. There have been progress in the protection of blacks in Brazil, Afro-Brazilians, with the affirmative actions being strongly supported by the courts, both for access to university and to public offices. The LGBT community in Brazil has found in the judiciary a strong protector of their rights. We now have in Brazil gay partnership, and we have civil marriage for gays, and that was unthinkable 30 years ago. So I think in life we should celebrate victories that we achieve. The indigenous peoples have encountered in the judiciary strong protection for the demarcation of their lands, and I think this is an important achievement. And one thing I want to highlight here that most urban people don't pay attention is whenever you demarcate indigenous people's lands, you are protecting the environment, because areas that have been demarcated, they don't suffer problems with the tearing down of the forest. So protecting the Indians is an important way of protecting the environment. We have important decisions involving transgenders, involving freedom of expression, animal ethics, which is a subject that's not yet in the radar of the mainstream in Brazil, but we have important decisions against cockfighting, against farra do boi, boar of the ox, but whatever, and vaquejada. So I think it's an enlightened role that courts play, bringing to the public debate this matter of animal ethics that is in the agenda of any progressive country at this moment. I don't want to say the Supreme Court always got it right. There are decisions that I would strongly oppose, like teaching religion in public schools. there was a decision of maintaining postal monopoly in the internet era. There was a decision that had very bad consequences when the cláusula de barreira, the barrier clause, the electoral threshold was struck down by the court and had as a side effect this multiplication of parties. But I think the balance of the Supreme Court and of the judiciary more generally in these 30 years of democracy is strongly and positive. So this is what I would like to say, the good things I would like to say about this period. There being some negative points too, and I would like to highlight two of them very briefly, looking back to these 30 years of democracy. The first one, it's impossible not to point this out, is the political system. When I say the political system, I'm talking about the system of government, presidential or parliamentary. I'm talking about the electoral system, proportional, majoritarian, or mixed. And I'm talking about the party system. We have problems with the three of them. I won't have the time to explore this here, but I do think Brazil desperately needs a political reform that can reduce the cost of elections, that can increase the representativeness of members of Congress, and that can facilitate governance. I'll give a very brief example of each of them. First, the problem of the cost. The election for the for the Chamber of Deputies, for example, it costs 5 to 10 times the amount that the deputy will be able to receive legitimately in 4 years of his mandate. So the problem of corruption in Brazil has one first cause, math. Because this gap between what it costs and how much you can make makes the representatives go seek for this difference somewhere else. And that's where the problem starts. Second, the problem with the lack of representativeness, which is a major problem also. The way the election, the electoral system and the elections for the Chamber of Deputies is organized in Brazil is a proportional system with an open list. So the voter votes for whoever he wants, or he or she wants. That's a good thing. The problem is he votes for whoever he wants, but he elects someone that he doesn't know who he or she is, because his vote goes to the party, and every time the party fulfills the electoral quotient, it makes one representative. Less than 10% of the members of the House of Deputies are elected with their own personal vote. 90% of them are elected with the transfer of votes from the party. So at the end of the day, the voter doesn't know exactly who he elected, and the candidate doesn't know exactly by whom he was elected. So it's a system with no accountability. If any of you want to know how your representative positioned in regard to the pension system reform or the labor reform, you just can't do it. You don't know, because you don't know exactly who your vote sent there. So we do need to change the political system to make it more representative, definitely, to make it less expensive. I won't talk about the party system because I don't have the time, and it's too sad a story anyways. The second weak point that I think I need to stress here is the systemic corruption that we discovered because it's been there for a long time. It's a cumulative process. It didn't start now. It didn't start last year. It didn't start 10 years ago. But it's a problem that kept growing. I'll be very brief in this chapter, and then I will conclude them, because we've been talking too much about corruption. But the reality is that the sense that this problem exists is fairly new in Brazil. What we finally realized is that corruption in Brazil was not caused by single individual failures. Unfortunately not. It was a systemic corruption that involved professional schemes of collecting and distributing money. A scheme to which were part public agents, private agents, state-owned companies, private companies, political parties, members of Congress, members of the executive. It's impossible not to be ashamed of what happened in Brazil. Although I think we should be proud. Probably no country in the world has had the courage of exposing a major problem like this and trying to fight it in daylight like we are doing right now. But what we realize is that corruption, as I said, was not the product of individual failures. It was the product, as I see it, of an oligarchic pact that was celebrated by part of the political class, part of the business class, and part of the state bureaucracy. A pact to plunder the state, to loot the state, and distribute privately public monies that were deviated. This is what happened in Brazil. What's new in Brazil is the reaction of the civil society. People not accepting anymore what was, of course, unacceptable. And I think this reaction by society has fostered a change of attitude in the institutions, a change in the legislation, and a change in the case law. And with cases like the mensalão, I know that first they had tried with the Banestado case, it didn't work. The mensalão worked better, and then the car wash operation, and then I think we are starting to change the country. But my perception is civil society is pushing the institutions, and we need to correspond to these demands of society. So I think the changes are in course, but there is, as anyone can see, a major reaction against the changes that are being implemented. And there are people, there are the representatives of the old order that would like to keep things as they have always been. And they are very powerful. And they have allies everywhere, as you can imagine, in the high spheres of government, in all powers of government, in the press, and even where you would less expect. And it's an ongoing battle, I would say. And the old order has two main groups, I think, trying to keep things as they always were. The first lot is people that don't want to be punished for all the wrongdoings they've done for many years, because they were sure that law would never reach them. But there is a worse lot. There are the people that don't want to become honest, neither now nor ever. They just want to keep things as they are. And they are very powerful, and they still are everywhere around. I think the good thing I would say is I think the country has changed. The train has left the station, or a seed has been planted, and I'm very convinced that nothing will be the same again in Brazil. What we should know, however, is that this is a fight that we win by points, not by knockout. So it takes time, it takes perseverance, but we should get going. I want to use here to end this topic and then conclude with an allegory I heard with the discussion with my good friend, Paulo Barroso, who is a law professor here in Boston and a political scientist. And the allegory he used, which I found very interesting, and I even wrote it down with my own words, but it's his idea, was basically the following. Suppose an individual that is addicted to drugs. He's very functional. He still can do his job and go on living. But the addiction is killing him. It's doing him a great harm. But nobody notices that. Nobody realizes he is a drug addicted. But one day, this individual realizes he's a drug addicted, and he decides to fight the addiction. Well, in the first moment, when he starts fighting the addiction, life becomes much worse because of the typical withdrawal syndrome that any addicted suffers when he goes to this process of detox. But that's the only way for him to get healed, to fight the addiction. Well, this is a good allegory of what's going on in Brazil. We got addicted to a way of doing business and doing politics that was very corrupt. And I think we are in the process of realizing the gravity of the problem and in the process of starting the detox, starting to get rid of the drug, which is corruption. So part of the crisis we're going through right now is kind of a withdrawal syndrome from corruption. We are learning with great difficulty to create a new threshold for doing business and doing politics in Brazil. The problem is the old has to leave and the new is still growing, but this is our role here, I think, to push history forward and make future come as soon as possible. I'm going to finish this talk with a reflection based on a book that I read recently, which is a great book, and it helps to understand Brazil, called Why Nations Fail, by two professors here from Boston, actually. They're on Semoglu and James Robinson. I think Robinson left recently. The central thesis of the book is, the book tries to explain why countries reach prosperity or they become poor. And the main argument is that countries that became rich are the ones that were able to create economic and political institutions that were inclusive. And the countries that became poor are the ones that were conducted by extractive elites that did not allow for inclusive economic and political institutions to grow. Applying these ideas to Brazil, although I think we made a lot of progress, we have not yet changed the main structural causes of corruption in Brazil, which I think are the political system and a state, a public sector that is too big, too inefficient, and that can distribute favors very broadly. And that's one problem. So we should not think that we are going to change Brazil with criminal law and punishments. That's part of the process, for sure. But we need to fight the structural causes of the corruption, and these are two of them, besides, of course, investing in education and other areas. So I think the process of creating inclusive institution in Brazil is very important to have this in mind. And I think we are living to use an expression of the same authors, a critical juncture, a conjuntura crítica. And at this point, we have this horrible ethical, economic, and political storm in Brazil. But this is the environment that creates the conditions to change the institutions and try to create inclusive economic and political institutions. I need to close because my time is over. What I want to say, as we celebrate 30 years of democracy, we have several achievements to actually celebrate, and I don't think we should disconsider this. We should not focus only in the devastating snapshot of the moment. We should look to the history of these 30 years of democracy. And these 30 years of democracy can give us some reassurance that the next 30 years will be as successful as the past 30 years generally, I think, have been. I think we are on the verge of a profound and peaceful revolution in Brazil, which is changing the threshold, the paradigm of public ethics and private ethics in Brazil. I think this is the task of our generation. This is the last task of our generation. We won the dictatorship. We won hyperinflation. We had important victories against extreme poverty. Now we have this important final battle, and then we're going to leave path for the next generation, which is raising the threshold of ethics in Brazil, starting with giving good examples. In a recently event that I went to talk, a student leader greeted me saying, Justice, Professor, I don't want to live in a different country. I want to live in a different Brazil. I thought that was a great quote, and I end with it. Thanks.
Thank you, Justice Barroso, for this insightful and optimistic account of the tough moments we're living in. I feel we need some optimism. Before starting our Q&A session, Professor Pande will make a comment on Justice Barroso's lecture.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I wanted to pick up on one theme that came up at the end, which was to talk about how do you build inclusive institutions. And I wanted to link that back to what I had been talking about, and to more broadly to how social scientists and economists would think about this question. And just as background, I think one way you could read the Acemoglu and Robinson book is actually quite a pessimistic book. It's a book that says that if you don't end up making the right choice at the right time, so when you hit this critical juncture, if you don't have the lucky accident of, say, the Glorious Revolution in the United Kingdom, well, then you may end up with the extractive elite, continuing to make a country not work well. I wanted to juxtapose it against what a number of people think about, is to say, well, if we think that people want to do what's good for them, how do you align their incentives? How do you get them to do the right thing? A different way of saying it is that perhaps everyone is capable of being corrupt, but in some places being corrupt is too expensive an activity, which is why they're not corrupt. So how do you take a country and make it one where corruption becomes not worth your while? It becomes too expensive an activity to do. The personal cost is too high. How do you take a country and make it one where actually investing in redistribution is the thing that is appropriate, that is actually something that you think is going to be the best thing, even if you only care about yourself? And so one way we think about it is we want to align incentives of different players, especially in systems where there's delegated governance, but we recognize that this is hard. And I think this is where information becomes very important. Information allows you to monitor, it allows you to have transparency. So as many of you are thinking about what is it going to take to build inclusive institutions, I would say the insight that economists working on corruption would offer is to say there are really two policy levers that are critical. The first is incentives. So think about ways in which you align incentives. You know, how do you set up penalty systems for, say, corrupt activities? How do you decide who gets promoted for being possibly, telling the truth, for being a whistleblower? And then the second is, what kind of investments in information and transparency can you make? I gave you one example, which was the audits of Brazilian municipalities. There are many other examples one can think of, but I think as one thinks of putting in place inclusive institutions, everyone needs sort of specific steps of what to do. Otherwise, it's easy to be pessimistic about the process. And I think to think about really aligning incentives and improving information are two key insights that we see again and again across different parts of the world.
Thank you. We'll start our Q&A session. I think we don't have much time, but we'll start with a few questions for Justice Barroso. So I will pose, I think, 2 questions here, and then you can choose how to answer them. So our audience is interested in this corruption problem in Brazil, and they ask if we can blame our constitution for the deeply ingrained corruption in the country. They are also worried about the moment we're living in, and they ask you if you think there is some military threat in Brazil today. And also, they wonder how can we, as a society, be part of this fight against corruption.
First thing I want to comment and thank Professor Pande for being here. I was so focused on what I was going to say that I didn't actually interact. And the other thing, Professor, when you speak in a foreign language, you kind of lose a lot of the rhetoric tools that you have in your own language. So when this happens, you better have some ideas or you are in trouble. So I was trying to focus on my own ideas, but it's a great pleasure and an honor to be in this panel with you. I don't share this view. I think the book that we're talking about, we're both talking about the Why Nations Fail. I think the message is you can always turn to the right direction anytime you want. So I don't think there is a historical determinism. I think history is not a fate that you accomplish. It's a history that you write. So we're trying to rewrite history in Brazil, and hopefully we will be able to. I don't think we should blame the Constitution, and probably we shouldn't look for one guilty object or one guilty person. We have a history in Brazil of from the beginning of patrimonialism, of private appropriation. That was very Iberian in the system in which the money that belonged to the kingdom was not separated from the money that belonged to the king. So the mixture between private and public in Brazil's history comes from the beginning of the colonization. This state that is top-bottom and not bottom-up has always been there, and it's very difficult to switch this balance. And I think that we've always had a culture of inequality. That there are people that are superior and people that are inferior, that there are people that are subject to the law and that there are people that are above the law. So we are fighting quite a few of these functions that have been there for many decades, for many centuries, probably since the beginning. So it's not an easy task. So I wouldn't blame the Constitution. Definitely I wouldn't. I don't fear a military threat. I most definitely don't. I don't think, and I think we should say something good about the military in Brazil. And the person that's talking to you right now was a militant against the military regime before the redemocratization. I strongly opposed it in many ways. But if there is one part of Brazil that didn't give any trouble in the past 30 years, that was the military. Exemplar behavior. And there's no reason why we should fear that. They have paid the very high price of being in power for such a long time. And I doubt that they would like to go through that again. We learned our lessons. What you can feel is that the military, like everyone else in Brazil, they are concerned, they want to change things for the better, and so do I, and so does everyone here. But there's no risk whatsoever, I would say, of a military coup or anything of that sort. We've learned our lesson. They've learned their lesson. And what we need to do, and we all want to do, is to improve the quality of politics. That's the way. In a democracy, politics is essential. The world and Brazil have tried the other options. Military dictatorships, technocrats, the political police, or religious fundamentalisms. There is no alternative better than democracy. So we need to cope with what we have and try to improve it. So my answer is definitely no. This is a ghost that I think we are rid of. How society can change. Professor Pande, are you originally, your family from India?
That's right.
Okay. I would cite Gandhi here. Start with yourself. Definitely. That's where changes start. So play your part the best you can. I think that's the first thing I could say. And starting from oneself, I think we can try to have governments that are more accountable, more responsive. But institutions are made of people. If people don't behave well, there's no way institutions can work well. If this is the end of my talk, I want to just use one last paragraph because I think it's very important in a moment like this. Brazil only really started in 1808 when the royal family came to Brazil, fleeing from a Europe that was at Napoleon's mercy, Professor Pande. Before that, the ports were closed, so we could not have trade with other nations. There were no roads, it was prohibited. There was no manufacturers, it was prohibited. There was no money, no currency, so things were done by scambo. I knew that word in English, but I forgot. And 1/3 of the population were slaves. And there was no school. 98% of the population in Brazil were illiterate. So this was the infrastructure in Brazil 210 years ago. Now let's take a look of the superstructure. We were not heirs of the Anglo-Saxon tradition that had the Magna Carta since 1215. We were the heirs, very dear as our Portuguese friends are, we were heirs of the last country in Europe to end Inquisition. Last country in Europe to abolish slave trade. Last country in Europe to phase out absolutism. So with that infrastructure and with this superstructure, in 200 years, Brazil became one of the largest mass democracies in the world and one of the 10 largest economies in the world. We were probably one of the most successful countries of the 20th century. We multiplied income over 15 times. So, again, we look at the picture, it's devastating. But if we look at history, we've come a long, long way. And we have many reasons to celebrate and many reasons to be proud. Not to be satisfied, but to be proud of what we have achieved and move on and try to do new and good things. And we can't wait for things to be perfect so that we are going to start doing right things. I read these days one poster that said, life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. Life is about learning to dance in the rain. So we got to keep going. And I think the most important message, and again answering one of the questions is that no matter what's happening around you, play your part the best you can.
Thank you.